So many survivors of narcissistic abuse are stuck in a perpetual purgatory. They're sad with them, they're sad without them. And part of that sad is also what these relationships do to us. They hijack us, invalidate us, and fill us up with a set of demons that set forth to dismantle our true and our striving selves, or our genuineness or happiness. One of the most compelling, succinct lines about trauma bonding I've ever heard, and one last video on this, it's from Succession. Let's take that line apart. I promise-ish that this might be one of my last times I talk about Succession. If you didn't watch it, you're burned out on it. If you did, even you might still be burned out on it. Now, here's the thing. You do not need to have watched this show. You do not need to be a fan of this show to find some use from this video. So it was a line that a character named Tom spoke to his wife, Shiv, about in their Hall of Fame toxic marriage. Here's what he said. He said, "I wonder if the sad I'd be without you would be less than the sad I get from being with you." So they were splitting up, and that's what he was commenting about. That line hit sort of the target square in the center, because that line is the struggle of everyone who ever wonders about or thinks about a narcissistic relationship ending or leaving one. It was the ultimate sort of line about how a trauma bond plays out, in this case, in this really dysfunctional marriage. The one thing that people learn when they leave a narcissistic relationship or one ends is that there was two different kinds of sad in this relationship. For so many folks in these relationships, there's a hopeful belief in relief that, if I can just get out of this relationship, my life's going to be better, I'm going to be relieved. And there's definitely some truth to that. But pretty quickly, that relief will get swamped by the other sad. And that's the sad of not being in this relationship anymore. And you might say, what? And that's what, again, what Tom's line was. And there's a reason for this disconnect. The sad while you're in it and the sad while you're out of it is very much a relic of a trauma-bonded relationship. You're doing so many mental gymnastics in these relationships to make it work, to make it make sense. Your brain is in a sort of dissociated, la, 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 I cannot hear anything space, so you don't have to think about it. And even if you've been able to convince yourself that everything in the relationship is fine, everything's fine, you don't feel well, right? You carry this sickness in you, a sadness, a sense of things aren't quite right. You might even feel it physically, a heaviness in your heart or in your head, a sort of gloominess that you try to push back on. And doesn't feel quite like depression or normal sadness, but this not rightness. That's the sad of staying. But that same trauma bond creates a sad of leaving. If you leave, and I often say that leaving or being pulled out of a relationship in which you're trauma bonded is a bit like cutting off a part of yourself. You may literally feel a sense of physical pain, a grief, physically like you're pulled back. Perhaps a grief is for what you wish it could have been, or a grief of wondering of what would have happened if I tried harder, or regret, or grief that maybe I didn't see it right, or what if they figure it out, or what if they get better, or the idea that maybe it wasn't all bad and there were some good laughter, good times, right? Or even just the grief that comes from the knowing that even though the patterns in the narcissistic relationship didn't feel good, they were familiar. And to step away from this relationship means having to have a reckoning with something deeper inside of you. And because of this, and this character Tom's prescient comment, which sad is worse, with you or without you? So many survivors of narcissistic abuse are stuck in a perpetual purgatory. They're sad with them, they're sad without them. And part of that sad is also what these relationships do to us. They hijack us, invalidate us, and fill us up with a set of demons that set forth to dismantle our true and our striving selves, or our genuineness or happiness. So it's not like just getting out of that relationship means that that internalized invalidation just goes away. But in his case, Tom's case, and he was a little bit of a narcissist himself, one is left with the question of whether life is easier with them or without them. Narcissistic folks take up a lot of our mental real estate when we're in relationships with them, and they take up a lot of time. I've had many clients say to me, my life was almost entirely devoted to figuring out this relationship. The rumination, the trying to get it just right, the exhaustion from what a roller coaster all of it was. And while none of that felt good, it took up a lot of time. And in that empty space that is created by the narcissistic person leaving, that can also be filled with sadness and doubt. Now, if you aren't a Succession viewer, just to give you a framework here, Shiv, the wife, was a bit of a malignant narcissist. Tom was more of an opportunist with a bit of entitled, vulnerable narcissism, a chip on his shoulder, a sort of money-climbing person who would endure any kind of bad treatment to have proximity to the goodies that money can buy. He was a person who was able to turn his victimhood into a strategic position. Being with her was an invalidating and emasculating nightmare. Being without her was something that left his Machiavellian and trauma-bonded soul yearning. Again, damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Ultimately, if you do have the capacity, the resources, the safety, and the supports to get out of a narcissistic relationship, ultimately it'll be a win because it'll give you the clarity, the distance from being manipulated and gaslighted, and then slowly having that procession back into your sense of self, or perhaps discovering it for the first time. Ending one of these relationships may not be a tidal wave of relief, but in the long game, it's going to probably be a win. However, when you're first getting out of a narcissistic relationship, or in the first year or so, again, it feels like a damned if you do and damned if you don't. The sadness is there either way. And I think that sadness catches people by surprise when they think, I'm getting out of something that's a mess. Why don't I feel better? And they recognize a very new kind of sad replaces it. This sad in, sad out is exactly why hoovering works, because there's a real vulnerability that the narcissistic person can sort of pull on to pull you back in. So I hate to say that we're getting grand relational wisdom from Succession, but what we are learning is that these were writers who knew narcissism really well. And more than anything, that trauma-bonded relationship, the sad that I feel when I stay, the sad that I'll feel if we're not together. Many of you, I'm sure, can resonate with that because there's a truth to it. And that leads people to wonder, did I do the wrong thing by ending this relationship? If I feel sad, maybe that means the relationship is good. If you feel sad, it is because the way these trauma-bonded relationships work is that ongoing yearning for this thing that was maybe perhaps somewhat familiar, that was something to do, and that sadly would almost, it was a byproduct of that voice you had internalized. All of that together accompanies that sadness when it's done. It's not easy either way. And I think the sad legacy of narcissistic relationships is it can really, really leave you with a sorrow for a long time, sometimes even longer than the relationship. One thing we know in the world of mental health is talking through our stuff helps, and it matters. Sometimes just releasing uncomfortable feelings and thoughts, getting perspective, and if you're fortunate, hopefully getting a little validation, being seen, being heard. And this is where things get tricky for folks in toxic or narcissistic relationships, because the patterns in these relationships are confusing. To many people, they just sound like relationship problems that are run-of-the-mill. And since the narcissistic person often presents quite well in the world, the people you turn to may also be dubious about your situation. So it creates a double bind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. So let's talk about the first kind of shame. The shame we feel when we talk about it. Many people say that they feel deeply disloyal when they talk about what is happening in their narcissistic relationship. Because unless there are big ticket things going on in the relationship, like cheating or physical abuse or financial abuses, the stuff that happens in these relationships is almost hard to articulate. It's hard to talk about being gaslighted or manipulated with someone who doesn't get it. And the pushback people get often is, well, maybe you misheard them, or they have their reality too, or don't make such a big deal out of it. Devaluation can sound like regular relationship stuff that people go through, and especially because the conundrum of many narcissistic relationships is that every day is not terrible, and the narcissistic person can often trick the world. We may not only have a hard time talking about why we are having such a hard time, but we may also be so caught up in the rationalizations and trauma bonding and all of it that we feel like bad people talking about it, and may really feel as though we are the ones who are engaging in betrayal when we even consider using language like narcissistic and manipulative and gaslighting. This applies no matter what kind of narcissistic relationship we are in. And in fact, lots of folks experience even more shame when it is a family member, and especially a parent. So the one thing that can be useful, even when people come to therapy, can magnify the shame. This issue of feeling disloyal when talking about the narcissistic person in your life is a common one. The thought that you are being dismissive for even thinking about them this way, and that maybe you are the hard-hearted one for having this perspective. And while we know that having support and people you can turn to get validated, that the patterns in your relationship are indeed unhealthy, and that what that person did or said is not okay, is in fact how people heal. Shame is such an uncomfortable, isolating feeling, and one that is often evoked when we talk about our narcissistic relationships. And this is how people get stuck. For so many people in narcissistic relationships, you can sort of get lost in your own private climate where criticism and cruelty and betrayal and devaluation and dismissiveness are all normalized. And we slowly get into a place where we do not take notice of these behaviors as a problem anymore. Emotional abuse becomes our normal. But there is a second shame, which is the shame that festers in us when we don't talk about it. The narcissistic abuse gets distorted within us, and we believe that we are not enough, that we are the ones who are doing the bad thing, and this seeps into our identity. The relationship steals us from ourselves, and the shame for many survivors comes from this unprocessed sense that we've given up on ourselves. But it's a war between our true identities, our true selves, and the self we have to maintain, the self we have to be to maintain an attachment or a relationship with the toxic person. While we can intellectually recognize that we did and said, and our sympathetic nervous system took the reins so we could stay in a relationship, which is a critical human need, there is still a deep shamed part of ourselves. And not only do we view ourselves as disloyal and all the rest of it for thinking bad thoughts about the narcissistic person, but we also feel as though we failed somehow as people, and not finding our voices or being ourselves or even giving up on ourselves, but don't recognize that that is the ultimate transaction of the narcissistic relationship. Love means becoming what they want and sacrificing ourselves. Even BS fairy tales like The Little Mermaid, for example, sold that to us as what love is. It's quite messed up. The second shame, though, is not so much the shame of not sharing, but the shame that builds up in us when we don't receive empathy, compassion, being seen, and learning that what is happening to us is not okay, and simultaneously having to give up on ourselves to make it all work, which drives that shame. But those two shames, the shame of sharing and the shame of not sharing, it's not like it's a real choice. And some folks go back and forth between the two. And it can be made even worse when you do share and are shamed by others for sharing, and then go silent again and find yourself sliding deeper into the sense of, what is it about me? What's wrong with me? And you know I'm going to say, it's not you. Giving voice to your experience, even if that means seeing someone clearly and accurately, as uncomfortable as that is not disloyal, nor is it a betrayal. It's reality. And reality is an essential ingredient to healing. I'm a firm believer that healing from narcissistic abuse best happens in groups, when survivors can hear and talk with other survivors, who are really the only people in the world who completely get it. Therapy is important too. Has to be with a therapist who gets it, because many survivors are often struggling with other stuff like anxiety, depression, and other expectable symptoms that are related to the harms and traumas of the relationship. But ultimately, it happens collectively. The shame starts to lift when you realize you are not alone, and that you can clearly see that another person's mother or brother or partner is narcissistic as they share what is happening. And that you can turn that insight back to yourself, or have someone validate, or just be present with what has happened to you. Shame is that voice that keeps us stuck. Compassion, empathy, and validation are the ways that we can feel safe again, so we can release that persecuting shame voice and give permission to our reality and psychological safety. And that takes a minute to happen. And it comes down to seeing what happened to you and then being able to acknowledge it as abuse. Means that the world kind of sucks. And relationships and family and all the narratives we're sold about that may not be all that they're cut out to be. And that there are some pretty awful people out there. That is a lot to take in, and people don't want to hear that. It's much easier to hear that the other person, the not abused, the person being abused, not the abuser, that the other person in the relationship is the problem for staying, for choosing this person to be in a relationship with, for not being strong, for being too needy, for upsetting the narcissistic person. You know the drill. I face resistance in lots of places and lots of forums when I try to talk about this issue. People are more interested in talking about and critiquing me about, well, why do you have to label? Or how can you be sure someone's narcissistic? Or maybe the narcissistic person's behavior is due to trauma. The conversation always comes back to the why of the narcissistic person, as though there has to be some form of reasonable explanation for someone being so cruel and so manipulative, and that explanation must somehow tie to how foolish the other person in the relationship was for not seeing that. To which I say, F that. People, I get it, people want to keep their fuzzy view of the world. They don't want to think that there are some relationships and marriages that simply cannot be fixed. They don't want to believe that there are people out there who had no place having children because they were so self-centered and entitled and unempathic and manipulative that it was a recipe for breaking the spirit of an innocent child. People don't want to believe that people can't change. So to keep that warm and fuzzy utopic vision of the world, a lot of people are willing to throw the people who are harmed by narcissistic relationships under the bus. As though the people in narcissistic relationships who are being harmed and manipulated are to blame for what is happening to them. The assumption that a person in a narcissistic or toxic relationship is too sensitive, or isn't trying hard enough, or isn't compromising. It's as though the people in narcissistic relationships are almost an inconvenient truth. And that has been the party line for a long time. It all results in double the harm for people who are in narcissistic relationships. Not only you being harmed in the narcissistic relationship, but also you are having to face the scrutiny and the doubt of a world who wonders, oh, come on now, it can't be that bad. And this gets triple magnified because the narcissistic person is often, not always, but often, able to seem oh so charming and cool to the world around you. I can't tell you how many times I have observed someone struggling with the various psychological harms of being in a narcissistic relationship, watching those people who are struggling actually being questioned by the people around them, facing disapproving stares for getting a divorce, being viewed as not being tough enough and because they left a job with an abusive boss, of being viewed as petty and difficult for disengaging or even going no contact with a narcissistic parent or family system. It's so much easier to do that and retain the naive view that life is fair, families are good, communication works in all relationships, that there are no truly mean people, and that mean people are just misunderstood. It's a lot easier to do that. It also allows us to keep believing in tooth fairies and Santa Claus and magical thinking of all kinds. If people want to walk around in some sort of Stepford haze about the virtues of marriage and family and blaming people who are in bad situations, then go ahead and do that. But please keep your damned opinions to yourself when you run into someone who has been through one of these relationships. And if you have been through a narcissistic relationship, please recognize, as I said, that you are an inconvenient truth to so many people. And this is even worse when the people around you are also in crappy relationships, but don't want to hear about what you've been through. And they sure as hell don't want to know about radical acceptance and how these kinds of relationships and situations don't improve. They would rather live their lives as moths towards flame. You know, you've been there. But it's easier to view you as the problem than to have to face up to the messes of their own situation. Please don't be the sacrificial lamb to make someone feel good about the mess of their situation. But this happens to survivors all the time, and it plays on your existing self-blame. We have been doing this to people since the dawn of time. Look at your history books. Burning and drowning so-called witches, who we now know were often just outspoken women who were tired of being abused. To this day, we are still more likely to question a survivor of assault than we are to accept that the world isn't always safe. Hell, we even blame people who have been burglarized, and the first damn question we ask them is, did you lock your door? Who gives an F if I locked the door? Some jerk came into my house and took my stuff. That's on the thief, not me. If we can blame people for what they wear and for walking down the street alone at night or for not locking a door, you can believe and know that we are going to blame people who are being harmed in their narcissistic relationships for being foolish or for being weak, or that it's your fault that you are being gaslighted. This isn't going to change. Just like narcissistic people aren't going to change, narcissistic belief systems, organizations, and cultures also aren't going to change. And it means that people within a society who have been harmed in these relationships really have no choice but to draw together and validate each other, and recognize that life isn't always pretty, and it's not your damn job to keep other people's fairy tales alive by shutting your mouth and taking the blame. The emotional and psychological harm that takes place in narcissistic relationships is real. I have watched it my entire life and studied it for a goodly chunk of it. It's real. How could I be so stupid? That sentence is a refrain of so many people who have gone through narcissistic relationships. And I don't just mean romantic relationships. I mean family relationships, workplace relationships, even friendships. How could I have been so stupid? That's what they say. And it's not even said with any kind of a light heart. It's really from a place oftentimes of shame. Seriously, how could I have been such a stupid person? I made such a mess. How couldn't I have seen this? Now that I see it, it's clear as day. Let's talk about the layers of how a person gets here. We can start by the basic parameters of narcissistic abuse. How is it designed? It's designed to leave you confused. It's designed to leave you full of self-doubt. It's designed to leave you anxious, depressed, helpless, hopeless, vigilant, aroused, traumatized, you name it. But it's definitely something that leaves you, more than above all else, confused as heck. And so what happens is when you're so confused, the last thing you're going to do is say, well, this is a mighty toxic relationship. I need to get out of here. No, your reality has been questioned so many times that you don't even know if you have any idea of what's right. Many times you'll say, maybe this is my fault. Maybe this is my problem. It's as though I'm doing all of this. So the idea that you would even think that need to get out of this is completely co-opted by this idea that I don't even know which way is up. I don't even know what color the sky is. And increasingly, your narcissist holds the keys to your own reality. Not exactly the best conditions to get clarity. That's piece number one. Piece number two to me is information and lack of information. As you know, I made this YouTube channel from no other place than to say, you know what, people need this content, so we're just going to start throwing it out there in good faith, and if it helps some people, it helps some people. It is helping people, and I can see that. And given the number of you that are tuning in, clearly there's some curiosity about this, but you didn't know. And many people had said to me, if I had read your book or someone else's book or watched videos on this, I would have known this and I would have gotten out. Or if my therapist had just been willing to call this out and say, this guy's a narcissist and is not going to change, instead of spending all this time on communication and finding different ways to say things, I might have gotten out. A lot of this is just about information. How are you supposed to do something if you're not given a template? The reason you're able to add 2 + 5 is not because you were born knowing how to add. A teacher once taught you this. The reason you know how to read is because your parents or a teacher taught you to read. The reason how we know how to do most things is because someone taught us, because we were given information. We ain't born able to do much else than to eat, go to the bathroom, and cry. Everything else, we're taught. Nobody taught you this. If I had my way, this would be built into the curriculum of every school in the world, and it would also be a required part of how we parent our kids, which is going to be hard if your parent's a narcissist. But the fact of the matter is you didn't know. So to call yourself stupid for not knowing, so for example, if somebody just now handed me a book, I don't know, written in a language I don't speak, I don't know, like gave me a book written in Hindi, I don't read Hindi, then I'd say, this is a beautiful language to look at, I can't read a word of this. Does that make me stupid? No. It simply means I wasn't taught this. Perhaps with time, if I was taught it, I could read it, make sense of it, and then I wouldn't be stupid anymore. But you're not stupid. You just didn't know. But because so many people in narcissistic relationships, a key dynamic is shame. These relationships are designed to shame you. Why? Because shame is such a key dynamic in narcissism. Remember that narcissism, in fact, some theorists out there would argue that narcissism is entirely a shame-based disorder. Their deep, deep insecurity means that they're driven entirely by putting this face to the world, and because they chronically live in fear of being called out by the world or finally being seen for what they are, they're constantly living in a place of shame. And shame, it often comes back at them because they're behaving badly. They get called out on it. That shame leads to more bad behavior. It's all a threat to their ego. And their ego is constantly, constantly caving into that shame, shame, shame. So what else do narcissists do? They project. So you're constantly having their shame projected on you. You're a fool, you're so foolish, why are you this, why are you that? It's always them projecting stuff onto you, and shame is a big part of that. And if you came from a family where shame was a major part of how you were raised, how things were talked about, how behaviors were enforced, you may already have a tremendous vulnerability and a tendency to shame. Throw that narcissist in there and their projection and your confusion, you're just sort of a ripe proving ground for all of that shame. And then, as a result, you not only feel stupid, you feel shameful, and you feel foolish for not having seen this. Another reason people keep asking themselves this question, how could I be so stupid, is the isolation that is such a big part of narcissistic relationships. You're isolated from everybody, right? There's no place to get validation. In fact, many people, by the time they finally enter a therapy room with me, have been enduring this for many years, sometimes decades. And they come in and they tell me their story, and they're so broken, and they're like, yeah, that sounds like narcissism to me. And they snap up and they say, what? And I say, yeah. And I thought that's why they came in. They're like, oh, I just wasn't sure what it was. And I say, no, let me break this down for you. But it is really that sense of how long they've been alone with this. And they said, oh, I saw one of your videos and you seem to be talking about what I was going through, but then I thought, let me confirm it because maybe it wasn't that. And they come in and it's clear as day. So that isolation means that you don't get validation, you don't get support, you don't get people saying this isn't okay, or the people around you may be your narcissist enabler, you may be your narcissist flying monkeys, maybe your narcissist people who gaslight by tribe, but you may even be sucked down further into the confusion. So how would you know? Are any of us ever going to be confident enough to say everyone else is wrong, I'm the one who's right? In fact, in one of my books, I cited a classical psychological experiment done by a guy named Solomon Asch. And Solomon Asch basically, and I wish I had a graphic, presented a card with 3 lines on it. And one was clearly much longer. They were labeled A, B, and C. And I think it was line B. That was much longer than the A for sure, and C was sort of in between the two. But B was clearly the longest. And Ash had a circle of people, I think like 9 or 10 people, and they'd pass the card around, and each person was asked to say, please say the longest line, and they would say it out loud. There were 2 people in the circle, though, were what we call Confederates. They were people that were sort of in on the experiment, placed there by the experimenter. So each people would say, B is the longest, B is the longest, B is the longest, B is the longest. Then they'd get to the Confederate, and the Confederate would say, C is the longest. What do you think happened with the next person? Even though B was clearly the longest, you know what they said? C was the longest. That kind of sort of giving in to social pressure is a classical part of the human psychological experience. And you can make you understand then why, especially when you're being gaslighted by tribe and everyone around you is a narcissist enabler, that even when you sense this doesn't feel right, when everyone around you is saying she's a great gal or what a great guy or you come from such a great family, you're like, huh? Idiot, maybe I'm the crazy one. You start feeling like you're in one of those horror films. But you're not the idiot and you're not the crazy one. This is all only going to stop when more and more and more of the world get wise to narcissism, but unfortunately the narcissists still make the rules. But in your own individual lives, you can take stock of this. You can become aware of this and know you're not stupid. It takes not just courage, but often blind faith to say no. I'm right, and I don't care that everyone else said it's line C, it is line B. I know what I'm talking about. And when you finally do give in and call this out and maybe even leave the relationship, it's very possible that people around you will start leaving you too. Well, if you're going to be like that, if you're going to call him out, if you're going to be so disrespectful of your family, then to heck with it, out with you. You sometimes have to tolerate being outed, being left, being abandoned, being mobbed, smear campaigns, the whole 9 yards, if you're going to call this person out. If you call this person out, you may lose a marriage, the financial protections, the companionship, or even risk the estrangement of your children. These are high stakes. So for anyone to call themselves stupid for not seeing this, nothing could be farther from the truth. Frankly, I think that the day when a person gets awoken to the pattern of narcissism in their life, it's two things. It's liberating and it's terrifying. It's liberating because maybe it's the first day you can stop blaming yourself, but it's terrifying because many times it's a call to arms. And you know that that call to arms is going to be complicated. You're going to lose people. It's going to be scary. And now you're probably going to have to face that narcissist's wrath. That's not stupidity. That's you trying to figure out a way to survive. So before you throw yourself under the bus and use that term, realize there's nothing stupid about it. It's an awareness, it's a wake up, it's something very few people knew about until they did. It's why I do what I do, because I worked for this in this area for years, and I'm going to be frank with you, I'm shocked that for pretty much the first 15 years of my career, no one talked about this, or the people who did, it was very, very much on the fringes, and I thought, well, we got to get this out there. More and more people need to hear about this. So I hope you can listen to this and recognize that even if you stayed for 50, 60 years, even if it's taken you decades to figure this out with your family, your friends, whomever, you're not stupid. You're just finally letting some really tough information absorb in and slowly but surely letting go of the toxic narrative the narcissist handed you and replace it with one that is more authentic and true to the goodness that is you.